Okay, hey, good evening, everybody, and welcome to our second of 7 of our presentations from our UCSB Natural Reserve System virtual seminar series. Thank you again for joining us. We had a great talk last week with our first speaker, Dr. Ned Baer from the Sierra Nevada Aquatic Research Laboratory, one of our reserves up in the Eastern Sierra. And today we're going to be coming closer down south to the Carpinteria Salt Marsh Reserve. Before I introduce the evening, I'd like to just first start out with a couple of our usual Zoom related housekeeping and how this will all go tonight. So first of all, the format for tonight, we are going to have a very exciting presentation by our speaker, Dr. Adam Green of Santa Barbara City College. He will speak for 30 minutes. Before that, our reserve director, Dr. Andy Brooks from the Carpinteria Salt Marsh Reserve, will present on the salt marsh and present our speaker for 15 minutes. And at the end of all of that, we're going to save 10 minutes for Q&A, and this is the chance for you all out there to be able to ask our speakers some questions. When you do that, please use the Q&A function, which you can see down on the bottom right-hand side of your Zoom monitor there. And there you can type in your questions. I will moderate the Q&A session, so please send them along for either Adam or Andy as you think of them throughout the night. All right, well, first of all, as I always like to do, I want to just introduce the Natural Reserve System and what we are. So the UC Natural Reserve System is a system-wide initiative, and this includes 41 sites across the state protected expressly for the purpose of research, education, and public service. There's really nothing else like it in the world. UCSB manages 7 of these 41 reserves, and as part of this series, we'll give you a tour of each of the 7 reserves and of the research and also the teaching that happens at our reserves. Tonight, I think we have a really exciting talk because we're going to focus, in contrast to last week, we're going to focus a little bit on teaching this week. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Andy Brooks, who can give us an introduction to the marsh and also to our speaker tonight. So thank you, everybody, for joining us. Andy?
First Zoom flub of the night. Leave yourself on mute. So thanks, everybody. I want to welcome you all on behalf of the Carpinteria Salt Marsh Reserve to our seminar series. As Marianne said, tonight, we're fortunate enough to have Dr. Adam Green as our speaker. Adam received his bachelor's degree in wildlife biology and chemistry from the University of California at Davis, and both his master's degree and PhD degree in wildlife ecology from the University of Wisconsin at Madison. Adam started teaching at Santa Barbara City College in 2004. In 2007, he co-founded and he continues as the director of the Center for Sustainability at Santa Barbara City College. He has been the chair of the Department of Biological Sciences and also the program coordinator for the Environmental Studies program at Santa Barbara City College. And he's the faculty advisor for the Student Sustainability Coalition. Adam's been a very long time user of the Carpinteria Salt Marsh, and I'm very happy that he agreed to be our speaker for this evening. So just before Adam gets started, I'm going to give you a brief tour of the Carpinteria Salt Marsh. If I can figure out how to share my screen here. Oops. Okay, I got all kinds of crazy stuff going on. This worked in practice, folks. So as Marianne pointed out, the Carpinteria Salt Marsh is part of the University of California's Natural Reserve System. And the Carpinteria Salt Marsh Reserve is 120 acres of the larger 230-acre Carpinteria Salt Marsh. And so on the left there, you can see a map of the state of California. All those little blue dots represent one of the 41 UC natural reserves. The red dot should be more or less on top of Carpinteria. The photograph on the right is an aerial photograph of the Carpinteria Salt Marsh, and that area sort of shaded in light green represents the Carpinteria Salt Marsh Reserve. So you can see the reserve takes up just about half of the marsh, and it's sort of the middle half. The Carpinteria salt marsh is an estuarine, which means it has fresh water flowing into it through both Franklin and Santa Monica creeks. It's an estuarine tidally influenced. The water comes in from the Pacific Ocean through the mouth located there to the south. Coastal salt marsh, or in simpler terms, we can just call it a coastal wetland. Now, a lot of folks ask exactly what is a wetland, and that's a little hard to define because there are actually multiple definitions, and it sort of depends on who you talk to as to what definition you get. However, they all three sort of share, all the definitions share about three basic criteria, and I've listed those over on the right. They have what we call hydrophytic vegetation, or in plain English, they're full of plants that like water. They've got undrained hydric soils, which in plain English means they're soils that contain water or that retain water. As you know, the soils in Santa Barbara County have a lot of clay, and clay is very good at retaining water. So that's one of the things we look for. And finally, we look for what we call a wetland hydrology or wetland hydrologic cycle, which means that for at least part of the time, they're fully or partially flooded with water. In the case of the Carpinteria salt marsh, that's salt water, right? So that's sort of what makes up a wetland. What do wetlands do and why do we care about them? Well, they do a lot of things. They store a lot of water, and they function a very important role in flood control. That picture in the upper left there shows the Carpinteria salt marsh during last December's king tides. You can see the entire marsh is flooded, and it's actually storing all of that water during high tide. They provide erosion control. You can see waves breaking there along the Carpinteria salt marsh. They maintain water quality, an important function. The marine algae that you find in these salt marshes removes a lot of the excess nutrients that come down from the watershed, and they essentially suck up those nutrients and store them. They support a lot of biodiversity, something that I'll touch on in just a second, but they provide essential habitat for a lot of different species. A role that's becoming more and more important lately, they act as carbon sinks. So they actually combat global climate change. Salt marsh soils accumulate a lot of organic material, and so they store large amounts of carbon. And lastly, they're just beautiful places to visit and look at. And you can see a photo there in the lower right of Carpinteria salt marsh at sunset. Now, unfortunately, California leads the nation in wetland losses. Estimates place the total amount of wetlands within the United States that have been lost over the last 250 years, roughly around 50%. But the losses in California, especially in Southern California, are much, much higher. Southern California has lost approximately 95% of all its wetlands. These are both coastal wetlands and inland wetlands. This was one of the major reasons why the Carpinteria Salt Marsh Reserve was added to the UC Natural Reserve System in 1977. It was added to protect one of these last remaining coastal salt marshes in Southern California. Now, the Carpinteria salt marsh is really sort of a natural ecosystem that occurs in a very urban landscape. And so there's an aerial photo there showing the marsh with the backdrop of the city of Carpinteria. The map in the lower right is an 1869 survey map. And you can see that even in 1869, there was a lot of agriculture along the northern margins of the marsh, but the city of Carpinteria really hadn't grown to its current extent. That small photo there in the lower left shows some of the land uses that are occurring in the watersheds that feed into the Carpinteria salt marsh. And you can see it's a mix of open field farms, greenhouses, orchards, a lot of urban environment, businesses, homes. And then the marsh itself is that little tiny area sort of there in the lower left. So this sets up a really interesting sort of contrast between the natural environment of the marsh and the urban environment of the surrounding area. And it really makes the marsh function as an incredible natural laboratory to look at the impacts of urban areas on salt marsh ecosystems. Now, I mentioned that one of the things that marshes do is preserve biodiversity, and the biodiversity within the Carpinteria salt marsh is incredibly high. We have over 250 species of plants. I've shown 3 actually that are listed as either endangered or threatened species that can be found in the marsh. over 100 species of birds, and 150 species of marine fishes and invertebrates. And that includes native Pacific oysters. We happen to be the northern limit for fiddler crabs. You won't find them any further north than Carpinteria. And if any of you had visited the marsh right about this time of year, you may have seen the large school of leopard sharks that come in every fall to spawn. Now, as Marianne mentioned, the natural reserve system was established really to accomplish sort of three goals. And I've listed the mission statement here for the UCNRS. And I've highlighted in red what we're going to be discussing this evening, and that's supporting university level teaching. And so I'm very happy that Adam's agreed to be our speaker. Adam has been bringing his classes, as I said, to the Marsh for at least the last 15 years, if not longer. But in addition to classes from Santa Barbara City College, these are some of the other institutions that regularly bring classes or use the Marsh in teaching. And even non-university groups like the Santa Barbara Museum of Natural History actually bring some of their bird watching, their adult education bird watching classes to the Marsh. So you can see the Marsh is widely used by most of the colleges and universities within sort of the immediate area, all the way as far south as San Diego. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Adam, and I'm going to let Adam make a few introductory remarks, and then we can get on with this talk. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Andy. So we're going to do this kind of a little bit differently, possibly than some of the other webinars you guys have seen before, because what I did was actually created a video of my talk. And I did that for a couple of reasons. One, it keeps me on time, which anybody who knows me knows that that's an advantage because I tend to just keep going on and on. But the other is you'll actually get a sense of the types of things we're trying to do for our students, especially with COVID and a lot of other aspects of this major transition to being fully online. You'll get a sense of the type of video work that we're doing. And again, I'll mention that near the end of the video of how important it was to have access to these reserves in order to create this type of content. So I'm going to basically go off to the side here, and Marianne's going to start the video. She also put in the YouTube link. That's a direct YouTube link for the video. And the reason we did that was because if for some reason you're having a slow connection with Zoom and the video is not working great for you, you can go straight to the YouTube link and just kind of forward to about where we are and watch it that way. And it might just be a little bit smoother for you. So I will kind of go back on to mute, and Marianne, if you're ready to go, you can go ahead and start it. Santa Barbara in the small town of Carpinteria. It is bordered by a train track and Highway 101. It also has a number of homes along its edges, as well as some retail space and warehouses. There's open field agriculture in the foothills, as well as large greenhouse operations that are just across the highway. This makes it a rather unique location, both in terms of the biology and ecology of the site, but also in terms of the human impacts. Tidal estuaries like the Carpinteria Salt Marsh experience significant fluctuations in water levels between a high tide and a low tide. The difference can be as much as 6 or 8 feet in water levels in the channels, and it can actually result in many species going from being out of the water to being completely submerged. Not only is that submersion an issue, but you also have the fact that shallower water will tend to warm up and deeper water will be cooler, so you have a significant temperature fluctuation throughout the day. And the fact that you have a tidal influence coming in from the ocean, as well as evaporation, means that you're also going to have substantial fluctuations in salinity. These types of environmental stressors push the species that survive in these zones to have adaptations to tolerate that fluctuation in temperature, that fluctuation in salinity, fluctuation in water levels, and present some really interesting species that you're not going to find in other ecosystems in this area. The two-dimensional nature of these estuaries and salt marshes really means that they are both often overlooked and also great places to actually observe wildlife. Many of my students have seen these salt marshes and estuaries, Devereaux Slough, Carpinteria Salt Marsh, but oftentimes they're passing by them on the way to the beach to go surfing. At the same time, if you can actually get them into the marsh and teach them some about the biodiversity, it's actually pretty readily available to observe. And so one of the best things we do in the salt marsh is to just look at bird diversity. Birds are diurnal, they're easy to see, they make vocalizations, they're not microscopic, and so it's a great inroad into the understanding of biology and wildlife and biodiversity. I can easily teach students how to use binoculars, and I know that if we go into the salt marsh, they're going to see something. There's lots of bird diversity in this site, and there's not going to be much that's obstructing their view. It's not like going into a dense forest, and even if there's lots of species there, it takes time to figure out techniques in order to actually observe them. Here in the marsh, we can see a lot of different species of waterfowl and shorebirds, herons and egrets, predatory birds, any day and time that we go. And so it really is an opportunity to ensure that students will have a positive experience, be able to see something and learn a very basic technique that's necessary in biology. There are a lot of ways to teach biology. There's the traditional lecture where you have the expert in the field standing in the front of the classroom and the students are listening and dutifully taking notes. We have the laboratory, where you go into the lab and you might be doing experiments or you might be looking at specimens. But when it comes to things like a lot of aspects of environmental science, ecology, the study of ecosystems, study of biodiversity, it's hard to beat being out in the field. And this is, just one of those aspects where the more senses you can get involved with learning, the better. Students can listen to lecture, they can see visuals. Go into the laboratory, you can actually get some more of the tactile, hands-on components that are critical. But one of the things about being out in the field, standing in the carp salt marsh, you feel the temperature of the area, you feel the breeze, you feel the dampness of the fog, you can smell the marsh, you can hear the birds in the background. It really is just surrounding you. You are immersed in that ecology. And there's something about that that's just one step better and different than being taught in a classroom in our lab. And I think a lot of us as biologists that were attracted to being field biologists and being out in the field kind of knew that in a sense, but we probably couldn't necessarily put our finger on it when we first became biologists. But as an instructor, you start to reflect on that and you start to really see this is the thing that differentiates this type of teaching from being in a lecture hall or being in a laboratory inside, is you can't replicate these other components in a lecture or in a lab. You can't replicate the smell of the marsh. You can't really replicate the feeling of standing at the base of a giant oak tree and watching acorn woodpeckers fight it out, or waking up in the morning next to a beautiful creek at Big Creek Reserve, or crawling around on the rocks and searching for invertebrates in the rocky intertidal at Rancho Marino. You can't replicate that any other way. And one of the things that we see as instructors is students will connect the concept, the data, the science to the experience. And so when you ask them about biodiversity surveys or some type of equation that might be useful in calculating a relative measure of biodiversity, their mind is going to go back to that experience of that, all the sounds and the smells and the feel of crawling around in the intertidal. Have you talked to them about the various components of a watershed and the critical aspects of, an estuary, they're going to remember all of those different feelings associated with being in the space of the carp salt marsh. And having those interconnections, making those connections in your brain between the knowledge, the data, the science, and that physical experience is powerful. And I really believe it actually helps in the learning process. It helps students remember the concepts. It helps them connect them to something that they've experienced. It makes the concepts more relevant, more timely. All the things that we want to have in a good course is manifested by bringing them into these sites and teaching them in the field where that type of concept, that type of science was done, and where we got that information so they can see it and feel it firsthand. Another thing we can't replicate in the classroom is the opportunity to work shoulder to shoulder with a researcher in the field. One of the great benefits of the reserve system is there's a lot of active research going on, and there's oftentimes researchers, postdocs, graduate students, undergraduate interns are all out in these reserves collecting data for an active research project. And every so often we have the ability to get our students involved with that and to be out in the field with them, collecting data and getting to get a feel for real science, like not something that was just created as a hypothetical example by a professor for a lab class, but actually going out in the field and collecting data that could potentially, for example, be used in a research project. So there's just no way for me as an instructor to be able to find something that is equivalent to going out and trapping small mammals and looking for ectoparasites on their skin with Dr. Sarah Weinstein, or to have them crawling around in the grass and identifying plants and looking at remote sensing equipment with Dr. Dar Roberts. And those students that worked with Dar are going to remember him helping them identify plants, talking about his remote sensing, while at the same time on a conference call with NASA, or being in Sedgwick and climbing into a muddy hole with Josh Schimmel and talking about soils and the importance of soil biology. This is just not something an instructor can replicate in a lecture or a lab setting. This is what the UC Reserve System really provides for us that is unique and valuable and will have an impression on these students probably for the rest of their lives. Community college students are a very diverse group. You have some that didn't do very well in high school. They lacked motivation or lacked direction or opportunity. And so they were struggling, and they're looking for something that's going to hook their interest and possibly get them kind of back on track with their education in hopes of getting a good career. You have some that know that they're going to transfer to a four-year institution and have done well, and they're looking to save a bit of money. You have students that are returning and wanting to start a second career. You have students that maybe just don't really know quite yet what they want, and they're just exploring. They're trying a bunch of different classes, and they're trying to see if maybe there's something there that's of great interest to them that they might want to pursue further. Most of the students are working at least one job, often more than full-time, generally multiple jobs. They often will have a lot of family responsibilities. They may be taking care of their parents or their siblings or children of their own. And so they don't really have a lot of free time. They probably have not had the opportunity to get out into natural systems, to go hiking and backpacking, or to really kind of get into the study of biology on their own. And so much of this is very new to them. Even our local students, the students that are from Santa Barbara, many of the places we take them, that's the first time they've ever been there. And we also, of course, get students from outside the area. They're outside the county or the state, and we get international students, and they're not familiar with the Santa Barbara region. They're not familiar with kind of some of the interesting biodiversity we have here in the central coast of California. And so every time we get them out in the field, it's an opportunity to teach them something new, to expose them to this kind of beauty of biodiversity and biology. And it takes them out of some of the stresses of the rest of their lives for a brief period of time, and they can focus on kind of some of the beauty of these natural systems. I teach two classes that take advantage of the UC Reserve system. My Environmental Science 111 lab is really kind of at an introductory level. It's just more of a broad overview of some of the issues we are looking at in environmental science. Doesn't really involve a lot of heavy techniques in environmental science or biology, but it gets them out into different ecosystems. It gets them out into different areas around the Santa Barbara region, and we talk about human impacts on the environment, as well as how the changing environment affects the human population. In that type of class, a single visit to a site for a couple of hours to teach them a bit about the ecology of the system is generally the extent of it. But we also teach a more intensive course, Biology 130, which is field methods in biology. And that course is really designed to train a student to be a good field biologist. How to keep a good field notebook, how to collect quality data, how to make sure that you're doing the proper techniques, why those techniques might be used in a given system or on a given species. And it really is designed for the students that are likely going to go forward in biology or possibly looking to get jobs as field biologists, working for a research group or working for a non-government organization or some sort of possible environmental consulting firm. And the UC reserves are incredibly important for that type of class. And the reason is there's just no other place you could really take students for the extended period of time that we take them into the field. We'll be on a given Friday, we might spend 6 or 8 hours at the Carp Salt Marsh or one of the other reserves and going into in-depth study of a site using a variety of techniques. The other thing that we do in that class is we have 2 full weekend trips, and we take them to, again, a UC reserve for a full weekend where we camp at the site or stay in the housing that's available, and we push them 16-hour days doing just one technique after another in a different component of that reserve system. And not only is that so important for them to really get a feel for what field biology is, what's required, to learn the basic skill set so they can be potentially hired later for a job. Because the students are going through this intensive training, they now have a skill set. And oftentimes the researchers that have worked with us become the first places they go to apply for an internship. And we've had more than one student actually successfully get very good quality internships with some of the people that we've worked with in the field at one of the reserves. You'll hear from Sarah later on, and actually one of our students got an internship with her and again continued to develop that skill set as a field biologist. She went on to get another internship at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute and has now come back to UCSB as a PhD student with a national fellowship. It's important to understand just how critical the reserve directors are in this educational process as well. They really are kind of the experts of the reserve, and they can give us an idea of where to find things, what types of projects might be suitable in a given area, what types of research are already going on. I rember being in Big Creek and we wanted to put out trail cameras, and we were trying to see, it's always kind of cool if you can get the charismatic megafauna on camera. And so, we asked Fainer, where do you find the mountain lions? And he said, put a camera right here on this trail and you will get one. And you would think in a reserve that size, how could it be that certain that you're going to see a mountain lion go by in that one spot? And guess what? He was absolutely right. We put up a camera right there, got a mountain lion. And it's to this day the only mountain lion I ever have on film. Nobody else has that depth of knowledge. Nobody has that deep understanding. And to be able to go out in the reserves with the director who has been living there 24/7, working with the different researchers. To be able to go out with Don Canestro into the Rocky Intertidal of Rancho Marino and do a survey of algae and intertidal species, and to have this guy there who is just truly an expert and an amazing guy who we sadly lost in 2018. But to have him out there, and he was such a character. He'd be out there in the intertidal in his typical jumpsuit and his dog hanging out with us, and maybe possibly even some goats showing up. And the students they'll never forget that. They'll never forget crawling around that Rocky Intertidal with Don and identifying different species and the excitement they had and the excitement he had in showing them that diversity and cataloging it. it really is kind of a critical component, and I don't think people really always get exactly how important those reserve directors are. They're not just maintaining the sites, which they are. They're not just maintaining the housing, which they are. They're not just dealing with a series of unfortunate events like wildfires and debris flows and lack of funding and everything else, but they're also working with educators like me and helping me connect with some of these researchers out in the field so that I can tap them for a talk and say, hey, I know that you're going to be there at the time we're going to be there. Do you think you could come out and speak to my students for an hour and talk about your research? Or maybe we could do a lab that collects data on one of your field sites. And it would be far more difficult to create those opportunities for students if you didn't have this dedicated director there, reserve director, making those connections for us and really being excited to do it. They love that stuff. They love seeing people learn about the site that's their backyard and is their day-to-day life. One of the other benefits to these UC reserves for the students and for the faculty themselves is not always so obvious. It's just the ability to be in these places. There's a lot of natural places you can go. There's trails, there's state parks, national forests, national parks, but you're often surrounded by a lot of people when you're there, and it's very difficult to actually find places where you don't have a lot of people around you, don't have a lot of noise. Sadly, silence is become quite endangered these days. But the UC reserves, many of them are actually very quiet places. They don't have a lot of people and passersby. You don't have a lot of human-created noise in the area. Mostly you have possibly some other students or maybe some researchers, but it really gives you an opportunity to have students find kind of that quiet in a place like this. And we take advantage of that. We actually assign students an activity that is, I always say, it's the activity that is the lack of activity, and it's called a sit spot. And we basically say, okay, you got to find a safe place, but you have to, turn your phone on mute, don't answer it, don't text, don't be distracted by other things, and just find a spot and sit and listen and observe. And we have them do it for usually at least 45 minutes, sometimes more than an hour. And it's can be very transformational. One is you get a much better sense of an area and of where you are when you just sit in a place, when you're not walking through it and talking to other people, when you're not distracted by other worries and concerns and stresses. But we try to get them to really focus on kind of quieting their mind and to sit quietly in these spaces and to just observe what's going on around them. And it's also a technique that is very effective in biology, because oftentimes one of the best ways to see wildlife and observe wildlife is to sit in a spot quietly and not be a threat. And wildlife will start to get used to you and start to move around and have more natural behaviors around you. But it's also an opportunity for us to kind of show students that benefit of just that very simple act of being quiet in a place. And just about every time we teach these classes and have those activities, students often mention as that being one of the most interesting and most enjoyable aspects of the labs was the sit spot. All too often we're moving through space and time so quickly. We have all of these other things distracting us. We have our phones, we have ear pods in our ears, we have video games or movies, we have other people around us we're talking with, and we may be outside, we may even be in nature, but we're not actually in nature. And this gives them that opportunity to do that. And there's just not that many places, sadly, that we can do that effectively, because on so many of the other areas you might do that, a public trail or a state park, you're eventually going to be disturbed by people that are going to be moving through that area, or you're going to hear a lot of human-created noise. But there are still some spots, thankfully, and we find them in the UC reserve system where we can do that. Another one of these great benefits for education for me is a very personal one. Getting up in the morning and walking through in that morning light and observing or taking photos of birds or flowers or insects, or just sitting and watching the world go by for a bit as I kind of brainstorm about what we might do in a coming class. That's my happy place. That's my therapy. And that's something that I've come to really appreciate about these reserves is they really are just kind of an amazing spot to reconnect for, we spend a lot of time, especially if you teach environmental science. I mean, I spend a lot of time looking at some of the harm done to natural systems by human activities. And you have to remember sometimes to get out into these beautiful natural spaces that have been preserved, and remember what it is you're protecting and what it is that made you a biologist in the first place. And so I really appreciate that in these reserves. And I know, the faculty that teach with me in these field classes, I mean, they'll come and do it for free because they just love being out there. They just love an excuse to get into some of these beautiful reserves and hang out and, be with the students and just to be in nature. Now, the COVID-19 pandemic threw everybody for a loop. With education, community college I teach at, within a couple of weeks, we had to transition every one of our classes to fully online. And lectures were hard enough, but labs, when you're used to bringing students out in the field and you're trying to now figure out a way to teach a similar quality lab to students and have it be completely online, that's a challenge. And so as an example, I wanted to do as much as I could to kind of bring the field to them if I couldn't get them into the field. I mean, we couldn't even really ask them to go out into the field on their own because we were worried that there could be unsafe situations with COVID and people in the area and things like that. So we really had to make it as good as we could, but virtual. And some of us really went into figuring out, like, how can we bring some of the field to them? And that meant going out and videotaping ourselves out in the field, collecting data, doing the techniques, showing the students how this was done, showing them the ecosystems that we would normally have taken them to. And that's no easy task. It takes a lot of time. I invested a lot of money into equipment for images and video, audio, and you've got a ton of kind of expensive gear you're hauling around. You've got to get everybody out there at the same time. You've got to do all this video work that's sensitive to outside noise. It takes a couple of different tries to get it right, a lot of hours during the day to try to collect different images or different video clips. And again, this is where these reserves really benefited us. I was really pleased when Andy went to bat for us as faculty and made the case that we should be allowed to be able to go in the reserves, even during the COVID lockdown, to do this type of video work as instructors, taking all the precautions, and there was just 2 or 3 of us that might do it at a time. But it allowed us to capture video footage that could at least come close to what the experience might be if students were with us out in the field. And I don't really have any pictures, unfortunately, of the setup I would have like at the Carp Salt Marsh, where I'd have 2 or 3 tables set up with different cameras and different lenses and different audio equipment and everything else. It's nice to be in a reserve where you could set all that up and leave it there and it's not going to be messed with, and where you could go out with another biologist and they could be doing a field technique, and you're going to be able to do that without much interruption. You're not going to have a lot of passersby or outside noise that's going to interrupt you, and you can be efficient. A lot of the video that you're seeing here on birds and some of the techniques we did in the Carp Salt Marsh, I mean, all that was taken in 1 day, 1.5 days. A lot of good footage you can gather that if you're kind of left alone to be able to do it. And so we got that opportunity to go into the reserves for that. And if this impresses anything upon anyone that has control over this, is to really allow that to happen. That ended up being a real value to community college instruction when it came to the labs, was the ability to go into these sites and get images and video footage that we could use for online options. And going forward, we're going to bring back a lot of the face-to-face labs. I mean, we know as biologists that's an important thing for students, but there's going to be an increased demand and increased offerings of online as well. And so the more good quality video footage we can get in these natural systems and to show the beauty of this ecology for our students, the better. And this ended up just being one of those real values of the UC reserve system, that and I kind of took for granted as an individual, and I would take pictures and things like that for my labs. But when it came to doing video work and trying to get good video and good audio, it really was a benefit to be able to be out there on our own and in one of these reserves. So I hope I was able to convey just how important these reserves are to our teaching, to our own reconnection with nature. Giving us the ability to bring students to these sites can be life-changing for them. They get to work together in this incredible location, working with other researchers, learning about unique and interesting ecology. It's an intense experience. It bonds students together. They form community going through these reserves and doing these labs there. And it's one of those things that we can offer students that a lot of other places don't have. And we would have nothing that could replace that. I mean, there just is nothing that can replace that type of experience. I hope 100 years from now, someone is giving the same talk and showing the same benefits that these reserves have for students, and that we can really maintain them and protect them and keep them as resources for this type of education. All right, so hope you guys enjoyed that. I know coming across Zoom, it can sometimes be a little, it's a little bit variable depending on your connections. Hopefully you guys were able to see that well. One thing I didn't mention in the beginning, but obviously got an idea of, is that I expanded beyond the Carp Salt Marsh and talked about many of the other reserves as well. And, Andy and I just felt that given this was kind of the one talk during the series where we were talking about education, that we could expand beyond just the Carp Salt Marsh Reserve. So I hope that didn't throw anybody for a loop if you're expecting something to be centered just on that one reserve.
Oh, that's great. Thank you, Adam. I really, really enjoyed that. And, one thing that it made me think about, especially, with your slides showing the impacts of the fires across the state on the reserves. We're all here, at least in Santa Barbara, we're all experiencing the Refugio Peak fire right now. So I just wanted to say, I hope everybody out there and their families are safe. My best wishes to all the firefighters out there who are always doing the good work. It's just a really tough time. And actually, getting your students out into the field to really, just like you said, experience and also understand what their natural environment is about will just automatically lend them towards being future stewards of our land and helping us to take care of a lot of the issues that we're experiencing right now. So I'm just so grateful to you for for doing that with our students out there too. I'm going to go back. I'm going to go into the Q&A now. So just to remind everybody, please submit your questions in the Q&A, and we'll try to get to all of them in the time that we have left. And I'm going to start out with a question from Christopher Lorty. And Christopher asks, did you track how extensively or how well the students responded to the videos? Were there any solo sampling that happened?
So, well, first, hey, Chris, we have a funny story. Chris and I we lived in the same place in Beersheba, Israel, while I was doing my master's and he was doing his graduate work. So I've actually known Chris for a very, very, very long time, much longer than we probably care to recall. I think I need a little bit of a clarification on what the solo sampling meant. I think, do you mean, did they go out and actually, for example, collect data on their own, as if, I would give them an assignment and they would go out and collect that data in the field as part of a lab? So I'm going to kind of assume I'm getting that right, but correct me if I'm wrong. In general, the videos, I think, have been well received, given that, everybody had to be online. One of the other things that, going a little bit further afield from, the topic here, but it allowed me actually to also capture videos from a lot of other places. Like, I've put together videos with the sequoias. I've put together videos I'm finishing up one right now on the Klamath River, and what's going to be happening with the removal of the dams. So it allowed me to bring some things in from areas that students would not actually normally get to go. I do also hope to add in more stuff from some of these other reserves that are a little bit further away, like Hastings and Big Creek, that not everybody from Santa Barbara gets to. For the most part, I think the students really enjoyed that as a way to get the information. I do a lot of typical too, just kind of I use Doceri. It's a program, a lot of different types, where you can put up slides and you can draw on the slides and record yourself talking. And that can be reasonably effective for getting across concepts, but it really is nice to be able to add a little bit more of the visual, to be in the space. And so, whether it's doing something like showing the snowy plovers at Coal Oil Point, or, showing some of the bird life and bird diversity, or some of the techniques we did at Carp Salt Marsh, I think it really is a lot more valuable to them. It's more interesting to them, try to turn it into a little bit more of like a nature program as much as a lecture. I should give a shout out to Dr. Michelle Paddock. She was the one actually doing the work during those videos. And other faculty that come out, Jen Maupin, Professor Jen Maupin, who also teaches in the field and uses a lot of the reserves, as well as Dr. Matthew Kay. So as people are looking for faculty, for example, to do these types of field classes, those are some of those in biology that I work with and do their own courses.
Great, thank you. Here's another a great testimony, and also a question from Owen Duncan. And Owen Duncan says, I can testify personally that methods in field biology is a life-changing class, exclamation point. I'm really grateful to Dr. Green, Dr. Paddock, and Dr. Maupin, and all the reserve directors and researchers who make this unparalleled learning opportunity possible. Reflecting on the experience, I'm curious to know whether there's any plan to scale up the course or share the teaching model beyond Santa Barbara City College, beyond California, even though there's nothing like the NRS, Owen says. So yeah, any thoughts on scaling your course beyond its current?
Well, first, good to see you. Owen not only took our course, he then came back and TA'd it at least twice, I think, Owen. And was a great TA for the course, which is another opportunity some of our students have. This type of the field methods course is actually out there in some different universities. I actually, I went to UC Davis. I had a field methods course. It was taught over spring break, an intensive full week course. We went into Stebbins. I mean, I remember walking around that reserve with the, curator of the Vertebrate Museum at UC Davis, turning over logs and looking for, herps, looking for the lizards and whatnot that was crawling around. So, and University of Wisconsin, where I was a graduate student, they had one as well. And it was, I think, because I had courses like that, because Michelle Paddock had courses like that. That's why we brought it back to City College. It actually existed for a number of years. Dr. Larry Friesen taught it for quite some time, and actually had students out on Santa Cruz Island. He had the enviable position. He would just stay out on Santa Cruz Island, and students would just come out in waves to come and learn from him out there. And then it went away for a while. And so it was actually Michelle and I bringing it back when we started 2014. But Chris Lordy, who was just asking a question, Chris teaches a field methods class. So they're already out there in various forms. And, we're kind of just spoiled with the fact that we've got all of these reserves we can take students to, and they're just so perfectly set up for this.
Yeah, they really are. I'm going to tack on to Owen's question a little bit and just ask, Adam, have you noticed that there's a growing or greater increase in student interest in, I'll say natural sciences, but really anything outdoors? Because, a lot of what you showed too shows the importance of even filmmaking outdoors, capturing the sounds, capturing the images, so have you noticed a trend in increasing interest in either ecology or, anything that kind of has to do with the outdoor world?
I think to a certain extent, I definitely saw it started to increase kind of significantly in the first part of my career in terms of environmental studies. I was teaching a lecture. When I first started, I was teaching one section of a lecture, about 65 students in one lab. When it peaked, I was teaching over 200 students in the lecture and over 50 in the lab. It's gone down a little bit since then, but I think that's an overall trend in enrollment. And that's just statewide. And in Santa Barbara, there's been a slight decline in, well, not so slight, actually, significant decline in enrollment since our peak. So I think we're seeing that as just associated with it. I think there's an increased interest in it. And the aspect of this, though, is students are so strapped for time. And so if the course isn't something that's directly transferring for them, it's unlikely that they can take it unless they just have a real interest in it. And that Biology 130 class is one of those classes. I mean, we think it's an incredibly important class for anybody going to field biology, and students will mention that. I just saw a comment, JC Van Wert just commented on here. She was the student I was speaking about who's at UCSB now in a PhD program, and that's the thing that we love, but that course by itself doesn't absolutely transfer for everybody. And so it has a somewhat natural limitation to that. So really where we get the students for that class is word of mouth, students like JC, students like Owen, who have taken the course and just loved it. And then, and both of them in that case actually also came back and TA'd it. And then those students tell their, fellow students, hey, you got to take this course as you get the skill set. And that's kind of where we get our audience. I would love to see more of that. One of the things we're actually creating right now is a certificate in field methods at City College. So we'll have one that's associated with kind of environmental science. We'll have one probably associated with marine biology, and we'll have one associated with geology, where you can get a certification that would appear on your transcript. And we're also hoping that gives them a little bit more kind of concrete result from being involved in these courses and pull more students in.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So Greg M has a question that's somewhat related. Have you considered incorporating the teaching of some of your video techniques to your students? Future biologists or scientists might find themselves relying more heavily on that element, whether remote teaching or communicating with public or so on. Have you incorporated that into any of your teaching?
Yeah, I do it casually more than formally. I think for the most part, I'm always a little kind of intimidated to teach it because I've never had any formal training. I've just learned it as I did it. We actually did have a course on nature photography, and Larry Friesen taught that course, and he's been doing it for much longer than I have. And man, if you looked at his catalog of images, it's pretty incredible. I haven't tried to kind of teach it as something more formal, I think, because we have a digital photography program at City College, and it would be difficult, I think, because of that overlap, which department gets to do that. I think to a certain extent, like I don't have the formal training. I could show you kind of how to do it, but I don't necessarily think I could lecture on the formal techniques of it. But I'm always happy to do it with students that are interested. So we just had an EPA grant recently, and we have interns going out and studying pollinator diversity. And as part of that, we want to capture some images. So, I did an hour with them on just techniques I use with macro photography and that type of thing. It's definitely something I'd love to teach. I think it would take a little bit of finagling to figure out how to do it right without stepping on the toes of the digital photography department, and seeing if there's that demand. But it's, maybe it's one of the things we do through non-credit or something like that, and just go out in the field and, learn and figure it out. But one thing I will say to anyone that's like looking for that type of skill set, thankfully with digital photography, if you can afford the camera and the lens, the first part, the digital part of photography is made a lot easier. You're not spending a ton of money on film and processing. You can take thousands of images and go through and see what works and doesn't work, and teach yourself a bit easier now than when it was in the past, where you're so afraid to take a bunch of pictures because then you had to change film and you had to go get it developed, and it was going to cost a small fortune, and you didn't know if you got the image until you finally got the picture back. So one thing I will say is with digital photography, it's a little bit easier to learn on your own too. But I'm encouraged. Maybe I will. Maybe I'll offer a course at some point.
I would take it. So here's a question that actually I want to ask both you, Adam, and also you, Andy. And I'll start with you, Adam, and then Andy, if maybe you can respond second. But this is a good question from Jesus Munoz, and Jesus asks, what do you advise or recommend an environmental studies major consider doing after completing their undergraduate degree?
Oh boy. So the way I always start this is I had a friend of mine who happened to be a professional at working with people trying to find careers, and then got very much into sustainability. And her name's Linda Buzel Saltzman. And Linda was amazing at this. And I've always remembered kind of one of the things she said. She says, take the world's greatest needs, take your greatest strengths and skills, and where those cross, that's the thing you want to go after. Mm-hmm. And so I think if you're studying environmental studies, environmental science, you have a pretty good sense of some of that world's greatest needs component. I mean, you're looking at climate change, biodiversity loss, you're looking at, just communicating the science to the general public. But then you also have to look at kind of what's the thing that you love and what's the thing that you're good at. And that takes some individual self-reflection. And so oftentimes I see students that say, I think environmental law is incredibly important, but then they find out, I hate law. So it's not going to work very well. I mean, if you think it's important, but you hate it, you're not going to go very far with it. So you really have to kind of figure out what you are good at, what energizes you. Like when you're doing something, does it take energy away from you, or does it give you energy? And you have to really think about what that is and be very honest with yourself. And they have to try out a bunch of different things. So do you want to go into policy? Do you want to go into politics? Do you want to go into science? And so probably the thing that I would recommend, and I say this for any student that's graduating with this type of degree, one, get internships. Go out and get internships with people in the field, figure out if that's what you want to do, develop your techniques, your skill set. And it's that, I will tell you right now, that's more important in the long run than your GPA. It's more important than even specific classes you took. And it's showing in the research in terms of how people are recruiting graduates is the quality of their internships. That becomes huge. And it's going to teach you a lot about what you're looking to potentially do. And it's going to teach you a lot about yourself. And again, you got to be honest with yourself while you're doing that. And two, travel. Get out and see the world, especially if you grew up in a place like Santa Barbara. I grew up in Monterey, same sort of thing. We're in a bit of a bubble. The real world is different in a lot of places. There's a lot of other ecosystems. There's huge differences in, populations and cultures and socioeconomic status and everything else. And environmental change is affecting populations differently. I mean, if you've paid any attention to the issues of environmental justice, I mean, you're seeing how different the impacts are on different populations. Go out and see that, experience that firsthand. Don't rely on what you've read on the internet or, what you've learned in classes. Get out and actually do it. So for me, the greatest thing I did was take time and travel. And I just went out and worked as a field biologist for different projects in different parts of the world, and chose oftentimes to do projects in other parts of the world just to get that experience. Like I said, Chris Lordy and I were both in Beersheba, Israel. That was a very unique experience. You learn a very different aspect of kind of what's going on there, from everything from the incredible beauty and diversity of the country, but also you've got all these different cultures milling around in that environment, like the Bedouin that are living in the Arava Valley. You get a very different perspective on the ecosystem and the dependence of populations on those ecosystems and how environmental change is affecting them. So get your internships, start traveling. When it's safe, I guess, when it's safe.
That's great.
I can't add much more than that. Those are two perfect answers. The only thing I would add is that cast your net wide when you're thinking about internships, not only the traditional sort of internship programs that may be associated with colleges and university researchers, but NGOs, conservation organizations, museums, they all have internship programs, and they all can be really valuable. I think the most important thing about an internship is it gets you out in the field, where you're actually getting experience, and as Adam said, gaining a greater understanding of what that position might involve. And is it going to be something that you're going to like, or is it going to be something that just isn't for you and you want to move on and look for the next thing?
Yeah, and even if it's volunteer work, start with that. Get your foot in the door, because that will then evolve into probably paid work or another job someplace else. I mean, I started just by volunteering. I wasn't getting paid, but then working with that graduate student, he ended up with another project, ended there. I mean, I remember I got to go down to Panama and release harpy eagles in Panama, because the guy that was associated with that program was a graduate student, a project I worked with before. And so we knew each other. And he was like, it's a lot easier to hire somebody than to risk hiring somebody that you're not sure is going to be able to handle that change. And again, here's where those UC reserves come into place. Chris Sandoval, I know, I just saw her write in on this. Go out and work as a docent at Coal Oil Point. Go and intern there with some of the restoration ecologists. It's right in our backyard. Take advantage of it. Get that skill set. Get that resume builder, and also get that reference from somebody.
Yeah, the other thing I'd add is be persistent. You're going to hear no, and you can't quit the first 5 times, 10 times, 20 times you hear no.
Yep.
Just keep at it.
Yep.
All good advice. And I'm really sorry, everybody, that that concludes our time tonight. I wish we could keep hearing from both you and Andy, Adam, for the evening. This has been just so wonderful, and the comments are overflowing. I want to apologize to everybody not to be able to get to all the Q&A tonight. But I just want to let you know that this presentation will be posted up on the UCSB NRS YouTube page. So please look there, and you could watch this again, and also share the videos if you'd like. Next week, we will be going from Carpinteria Salt Marsh Reserve up to the Coal Oil Point Reserve, just a couple miles up the road. And we will hear from Dr. Sarah Weinstein from the University of Utah, present raccoon roundworm, parasite avoidance, and the landscape of disgust. So please join us for this sure to be intriguing presentation next week. And again, thank you very much, Dr. Green, and thank you, Dr. Brooks, for your wonderful presentations tonight. I know everybody really enjoyed them, and I hope everybody has a lovely evening, and hope to see you next week, Tuesday, 7 o'clock, same time, same place. Have a great night.
Thanks.
Bye, everyone.